The silence was the first thing you noticed, a profound geological silence that swallowed sound. Ray stood at the reinforced viewport of the hatch, his breath fogging the thick plexiglass. Outside, the world was painted in 1,000 shades of gray. The ash lay thick upon the dead Colorado landscape, a soft final blanket over everything that had once been green. 10 years. 10 years since the rupture. Not one supervolcano, but a cascade, a planetary sympathetic detonation that had choked the sky and sentenced the world to a long, slow death. Ray, a geologist, had seen the signs. He'd read the seismic data, the gas emission reports. He'd been a Cassandra in a world that refused to listen, so he had built the hatch, a reinforced concrete bunker beneath their farmhouse, a lifeboat on a dying planet, a prison. He turned from the viewport. The air inside smelled of recycled oxygen, canned food, and the faint, lingering scent of his wife's lavender soap. Elena was sitting at the small metal table, a worn copy of Moby Dick open in front of their daughter. Maya, 10 years old, a child of the twilight, traced the words with a small finger. Her world was this concrete box. The gray landscape outside was an abstract painting. The sun was a myth, a pale, sickly disk that sometimes appeared for an hour before being swallowed again by the perpetual twilight of the ash cloud. The whale, Maya. Elena's voice was soft, a fragile melody in the tomb-like quiet. He represents something untamable, something bigger than man. Ray knew about things bigger than man. They were floating in the stratosphere, blocking 90% of the sun's light. Elena's lessons were her form of defiance. She taught Maya literature, history, music. She would take out her old violin, its wood warped by the controlled humidity, and play Bach. The sound was thin and mournful in the enclosed space, a ghost of a world that no longer existed. It was an attempt to keep a small flame of humanity alive in the encroaching dark. Ray's defiance was more practical. It was in the meticulous rationing of their food supply. Canned beans, dehydrated potatoes, vitamin supplements. It was in the daily maintenance of the air filtration system, a complex web of HEPA filters and carbon scrubbers that kept the toxic air at bay. It was in the quiet, grim calculations he made every night, subtracting another day's rations from their dwindling total. They had enough for another year, maybe 18 months if they cut rations again. A slow, comfortable starvation. Ray was the only one who went outside. He had a suit, a patchwork creation of Tyvek duct tape and scavenged respirator parts. He called his excursions supply runs, but they were more like archaeological digs into a lost civilization. The farmhouse above them was picked clean. He ventured further now, into the skeletal remains of their nearest town, Calico Creek. He carried a modified shopping cart with large, rugged wheels, pushing it through the silent, ash-choked streets. The town was a time capsule of the last day. Cars sat where they had run out of gas, their interiors filled with fine gray dust. Houses stood with doors agape, their contents frozen in a moment of panic. Ray moved through this world like a ghost, his own breath a loud roar in his respirator. He scavenged for anything useful. A forgotten stash of canned goods in a collapsed pantry, a bottle of iodine from a looted pharmacy. A roll of copper wire. Every small find was a victory, a few more hours of life bought for his family. He never stayed out long. The filters on his suit were finite, and the cold was a physical enemy, a deep, penetrating cold that the thickest layers could only delay, not defeat. The rupture had triggered a new ice age, a gray one. One day, while scavenging in the shell of an old library, he found it. Footprints, not his own. They were fresh, carved into the deep ash on the floor. A cold dread, colder than the air outside, washed over him. He wasn't alone. He followed the tracks, his hand tightening on the sharpened pry bar he carried for defense. The tracks led him to a small makeshift camp in what used to be the children's section. A fire had been built in a metal trash can, its embers long dead. There were discarded food cans, torn open with a knife, and there were stains in the ash. Dark, almost black stains that even his practiced eye couldn't mistake for anything but dried blood. There were signs of a struggle. Overturned shelves. torn scraps of clothing. Someone had been here, and something violent had happened to them. Ray backed away slowly. He abandoned his search and pushed his cart back towards the hatch, his head on a constant swivel. The silence of the town was no longer empty. It was watchful. He sealed the hatch behind him, the heavy steel door thudding shut with a sound of finality. He went through the decontamination process, stripping off the suit, showering with their precious recycled water. He didn't tell Elena what he'd seen. She had enough ghosts to deal with, but the knowledge changed something inside him. Their concrete box was no longer a fortress. It was a potential tomb, and a potential prize for anyone who found it. The rifts in their small family unit began to widen. Elena clung to the past, to her books and her music as if they were a shield. Ray was consumed by the future, by the cold, hard math of survival. "We can't stay here, Elena," he said one night after Maya was asleep. He spread out his old geological maps on the table, maps of a world that didn't exist anymore. "Our supplies are finite. The air filter won't last forever. We have to move." "Move where, Ray?" she asked, her voice tight. "There's nowhere to go. The world is dead." "Not all of it," he insisted, his finger tracing a line south. The rupture was concentrated in the northern hemisphere. The models, the old ones, suggested that the equatorial and southern regions might be better. Less ash, more sun. There were rumors before the satellites went dark of green zones. "Safe havens." He pointed to the Gulf of Mexico. "Here, this is our best chance. If we can make it south, we might find a place where things can still grow." "That's not a chance, Ray. It's a fantasy," she shot back, her voice rising. "You're talking about walking over 1,000 miles through a frozen, poisoned wasteland with a child based on a 10-year-old hope? It's suicide." "Staying here is suicide," he countered, his voice a low growl. "A slower one maybe, but just as certain. I won't let Maya die in this box waiting for the food to run out." Their argument was a familiar, bitter dance, his cold pragmatism against her terrified inertia. They were two people staring into the same abyss, but seeing different monsters. The decision was made for them. A tremor, a deep groaning shudder from the bones of the earth shook the hatch. It was a common occurrence, an aftershock of the planet's agony, but this one was different. It was sharper, more violent. A hairline crack appeared in the concrete ceiling. A fine dusting of soil trickled down. Ray ran to the maintenance panel. A red light was blinking. The primary air intake seal had been compromised, a slow, steady leak. He could patch it, but it was a sign. The hatch was not invincible. It was a tomb in waiting. Elena looked at the crack, then at Ray, her eyes wide with a new, dawning terror. The fear of staying had finally become greater than the fear of leaving. "Okay, Ray," she whispered, the fight gone from her voice. "Okay, we go." Leaving the hatch was like being born into a dead world. For Maya, it was her first real look at the sky. She tilted her head back, her small face, pale from a life underground, full of a quiet awe. "It's so big," she whispered, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The sky wasn't blue. It was a bruised permanent gray, a lid on a coffin. They pushed a modified shopping cart, its basket laden with their most precious possessions, the last of the canned food, water purification tablets, the filtration masks, Elena's violin wrapped in oilcloth, and a single worn teddy bear for Maya. Each item was a weight, a burden, a memory of a life that was gone. Ray led the way, a compass in one hand, a sharpened pry bar in the other. He wore his patched-up suit, a scarecrow figure against the monochromatic landscape. Elena and Maya wore layers of scavenged clothing, their faces obscured by goggles and masks. Their journey south was a pilgrimage through a gallery of ghosts. They followed the skeletal remains of Interstate 25, a river of rusted cars half buried in ash. They walked through the silent canyons of downtown Denver, where wind moaned through the empty glass towers like a choir of the dead. The scale of the loss was absolute. It was a world that had not just ended, but had been erased. The threats were constant and impersonal. The cold was a relentless thief, stealing warmth from their bodies, forcing them to huddle together for pathetic comfort during the long, sunless nights. The ash was a choking menace, finding its way into everything, a constant gritty reminder of the planet's funeral pyre. And then there was the rain, not clean, life-giving rain, but a black, acidic drizzle that sizzled on their suits and left a chemical sheen on the grey snow. It was the sky itself weeping poison. They learned to read the land. Low-lying valleys were death traps, pools of heavy, unbreathable gases like carbon dioxide and sulfur. They learned to navigate by the ghost of the sun, a faint brightening in the eastern sky that passed for morning. 1 week into their journey, they met another family. They saw their small fire first, a flickering orange spark in the grey twilight. Ray approached with caution, his pry bar held ready. The family was huddled in the shell of a burnt-out bus. A man, a woman, and 2 young boys, their faces gaunt and smeared with soot. They were heading north. "We heard stories," the man said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "A government sanctuary in Canada. They have power greenhouses." Ray knew it was a lie, a rumor born of desperation. He had seen the satellite data before the world went dark. Canada was a frozen hellscape. But he didn't shatter the man's hope. Hope was a resource as precious as food. They shared a moment of communion, a brief flicker of the old world. They traded a can of Ray's beans for a handful of the other family's dried mystery meat. Elena played a soft, sad tune on her violin, and for a few minutes, the empty bus was filled with a fragile beauty. Maya even smiled, a small, hesitant gesture. They parted ways at dawn. 2 families walking in opposite directions on a dead planet, each chasing a different phantom of hope. The next night, huddled in the ruins of a gas station, Ray and his family heard the screams. They came from the north, from the direction the other family had gone. The screams were cut short, replaced by shouts and a single sharp crack that might have been a gunshot. Ray grabbed his family and pulled them deeper into the shadows, his hand over Maya's mouth. They stayed there, frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sounds of a brutal, unseen struggle. The lesson was brutal and clear. Kindness was a liability. Trust was a death sentence. The world was no longer populated by neighbors. It was populated by survivors, and survival had its own terrible morality. They pushed south through the dead plains of New Mexico. The landscape was a vast gray ocean. They encountered their first real test in the ruins of what had once been Albuquerque. The city was not empty. It was the territory of the scrappers. They saw them from a distance first, small groups of figures moving through the ruins like vultures. They were scavengers, living moment to moment, their existence a cycle of violent acquisition and consumption. They were led by a man they called Carver, a big bearded man with dead eyes and a machete strapped to his back. Ray tried to navigate around the city, but their supplies were low. He had to risk a run into the outskirts to search for food. He left Elena and Maya hidden in a collapsed subway entrance. It was a mistake. A scrapper patrol found them. Ray heard Elena's cry and ran back, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He saw them, 3 men, lean and feral, cornering Elena and Maya. One was holding Maya, his grimy hand clamped over her mouth. Ray didn't think. He reacted. He charged, screaming a wordless roar of fury, his pry bar held like a club. The fight was a clumsy, desperate brawl in the grey dust. Ray was driven by pure adrenaline. He broke one man's arm. He drove the sharpened end of the pry bar into another's leg. The third man, the one holding Maya, drew a rusty knife. As he lunged at Ray, Elena did something Ray had never seen before. She picked up a chunk of broken concrete and smashed it into the back of the man's head. He went down with a sickening crack. They ran. They didn't look back. They grabbed their cart and fled into the labyrinth of the dead city, the shouts of the other scrappers echoing behind them. To create a diversion, Ray made a terrible choice. He shoved the shopping cart, with most of their remaining food and supplies, down a steep embankment. The scrappers, seeing the promise of loot, diverted to follow it. It bought them the time they needed to escape. As they huddled in the darkness of a sewer pipe miles away, cold, hungry, and terrified, Elena looked at him. Her face was unreadable in the gloom. He had saved them. But he had also sacrificed their future. The weight of his choice settled between them, heavier than any of the burdens they had left behind. The loss of their supplies was a death sentence delayed. They were now living on the edge, their hunger a constant, gnawing presence. They ate insects they found under rocks. They chewed on the tough, bitter roots of dead trees. They were becoming as feral as the scrappers they had fled. Desperation was a physical thing, a taste in their mouths like rust and fear. Days bled into weeks. The journey south was a blur of grey landscapes and gnawing hunger. Elena grew weaker, her music silenced by exhaustion. Maya became withdrawn, her childhood stolen by a world that had no place for it. Just when Ray was beginning to believe they would simply lie down in the ash and die, they saw it. A light, a steady electric light, glowing in the distance. It was the first artificial light they had seen in years. It was a beacon of impossible hope. It led them to a massive, sprawling structure. A fortified shopping mall, its glass entrances barricaded with steel and concrete. A banner, hand-painted and tattered, hung above the main gate. It read, "Brighttown, the light in the darkness, all are welcome." Guards patrolled the roof, armed with crossbows. It was an organized, defended settlement. As they approached, the gate opened. A man came out to meet them. He was clean. His clothes were mended. He smiled. A genuine, warm smile that was more shocking than any act of violence they had witnessed. "Welcome, travelers," he said. "I am Brother James. You have found your way home." They were led inside. The contrast with the outside world was staggering. The mall's interior was lit by strings of salvaged LED lights powered by a massive bank of solar panels and generators Ray could hear humming in the distance. People moved about with a sense of purpose. They were thin, but they were not starving. There was a marketplace, a school, a clinic. In the central atrium, under the massive ash-covered skylight, was a sprawling hydroponic garden, green and vibrant and alive. It was a miracle. They were brought before the community's leader. He called himself Father Elijah. He was a charismatic man in his late 50s with a calm, reassuring voice and eyes that seemed to see right into your soul. He listened to their story with compassion. "You are safe now," he said, placing a gentle hand on Ray's shoulder. "Here, we are one family. We share, we provide, we survive together." Elena wept with relief. She looked at the green of the gardens, at the faces of the children playing in the makeshift school. This was the sanctuary they had been praying for. This was a place where Maya could have a future. Ray was more cautious. His engineer's mind was asking questions. The hydroponic garden was impressive, but it wasn't large enough to feed this many people. The solar panels could provide light, but what about the immense energy needed for the heaters that kept the mall from freezing? And the meat. They were served a stew that night, their first real meal in months. It contained meat. Tender, rich meat. Where did it come from? There were no animals. His unease grew over the next few days. He noticed things. There were no elderly people in Brighttown. Anyone who became seriously ill or injured would be taken to the infirmary, a section of the mall that was strictly off limits. They were never seen again. Father Elijah would announce that they had been sent on to the Great Light, and the community would hold a solemn, quiet ceremony. The meat supply was too consistent, too plentiful. Ray, using his technical skills as a pretense, asked for a tour of the power and recycling facilities. Brother James, the smiling man who had welcomed them, happily obliged. He showed Ray the generators, the water purifiers, the complex network of wiring that kept Brighttown alive. But when Ray asked about the food processing center, James's smile tightened. "That area is restricted, Brother Ray," he said smoothly. "For sanitation reasons. Father Elijah oversees the Providence himself." Providence. That was what they called the meat. Ray knew he had to find out. He waited until the night cycle. when most of the lights were dimmed to conserve power. He disabled a security camera with a magnet he had salvaged. He picked the lock on the door to the food processing area. He stepped inside, and the smell hit him. It wasn't the smell of a kitchen, it was the smell of a slaughterhouse. Clean, antiseptic, but underneath the bleach was the unmistakable coppery tang of blood. The room was tiled in white. There were stainless steel tables, bandsaws, and heavy-duty meat grinders. And hooks, rows of large metal hooks hanging from the ceiling. At the far end of the room was a walk-in freezer. Ray's hand trembled as he pulled the heavy insulated door open. The horror that greeted him was absolute, and it broke something inside him forever. Hanging from the hooks like sides of beef were human bodies. They were in various states of being butchered. Some were still whole, their faces frozen in silent screams. Others were just torsos, their limbs neatly removed. It was a larder of human flesh. Ray stumbled back, choking on his own vomit. This wasn't cannibalism born of crazed starvation. This was organized, industrial, a sustainable system of harvesting human beings. The hydroponic gardens weren't their main food source. They were a side dish. The people were the crop. It is a beautiful, efficient system, is it not? Father Elijah's calm voice came from the doorway. He wasn't angry. He was standing there with Brother James, their faces illuminated by the cold light from the freezer. They had been waiting for him. In a dying world, Brother Ray, the body is the last great resource, Elijah explained, his voice that of a professor lecturing a student. To let it go to waste, to simply bury it in the ash, is the greatest sin of all. We don't murder, we recycle. We honor the vessel by giving it new purpose. We turn flesh into strength. We turn death into life. It is the holiest of communions. Ray stared at him, at the placid, insane logic in the man's eyes. He had not found a sanctuary. He had led his family into the meticulously managed abattoir at the end of the world. They were seized. Ray fought, a wild, cornered animal, but he was quickly overpowered. They were locked in separate rooms in the infirmary. Maya was taken from them. She will join the other children, Elijah said gently. She will be raised in the light. The next day, Elijah came to see Elena. He brought her food, the same rich stew. She refused to touch it. He sat with her, his demeanor one of patient sorrow. "Your husband is a lost cause, I'm afraid," he said softly. "His mind is too rigid, too attached to the old ways. He cannot be integrated, but you and the girl, you can still be part of the family. You can have a life here, a purpose. What do you want from me?" Elena whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Elijah's smile was gentle, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "We are having a celebration of providence tonight. A new harvest has been brought in, a stray scrapper. We want you to join us at the table, to partake, to show your faith, to prove that you choose life over sentiment. Do this, and Maya will be returned to you. Refuse, and you will both be prepared for the next harvest." He left her alone with the choice, a choice from the deepest pit of hell, to die with her humanity intact or to become a monster to save her child. She sat in the sterile white room, the smell of the stew filling the air, and she listened to the sound of her own soul breaking. Ray sat in the darkness of his cell, a small storage closet. The despair was a physical weight pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. He had failed. He had led them here. He had traded a slow death in the hatch for a swift, horrific end in this abattoir. He thought of Elena, faced with that impossible choice. He thought of Maya, alone and terrified. The despair began to burn. It burned away the fear, the regret, and left behind a core of pure, cold rage. He was an engineer. He had built the hatch. He understood systems, and he would tear this one down. He began to work. He examined his cell, the light fixture, the electrical conduit running along the ceiling. He had nothing but his hands and the clothes on his back. But he had his mind. He managed to pry the cover off the light fixture. Inside were wires. He stripped 2 of them with his teeth. He waited, listening to the routines of the guards outside. He calculated. Brighthound's greatest strength was its power grid, and it would be its greatest weakness. When the guard came on his next round, Ray was ready. He shorted the wires, the lights in the corridor flickered and died. The electronic lock on his door, now without power, disengaged with a soft click. He burst out of the cell, tackling the surprised guard and slamming his head against the concrete floor. He took the guard's stun baton and ran. The mall was in chaos. Alarms were blaring. Emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows. People were shouting, confused. Ray's sabotage had caused a cascading failure in the main power junction. He had to find Elena and Maya. He had to burn this place to the ground. Meanwhile, Elena had made her choice. She was led to the central atrium where the family was gathered for the celebration of Providence. The body of the scrapper was laid out on a long table, prepared like a grotesque feast. Father Elijah stood at the head of the table, his arms outstretched. "Let us give thanks for this bounty," he proclaimed. Elena looked at the faces of the people around her. Their eyes were shining with a fervent, hungry light. She saw Maya, held by one of the women, her small face a mask of white terror. Elijah turned to Elena, a bowl in his hands. It contained a piece of cooked meat. "Partake, Sister Elena," he said, his voice resonating through the atrium. "Join our communion. Become one with the family." Elena took the bowl. She looked at the meat. She looked at Maya. Then she looked at Elijah. And she threw the contents of the bowl in his face. "Never," she hissed. Before anyone could react, she grabbed a lit oil lamp from the table and threw it into a pile of dry goods and salvaged fabrics near the hydroponics bay. The fire caught instantly. Flames roared to life, feeding on the dry materials, licking at the plastic structures of the garden. Panic erupted. The orderly congregation dissolved into a screaming mob. In the chaos, Elena ran and snatched Maya. She had to get to Ray. She had to get out. Ray found them near the main entrance, which was now blocked by a terrified crush of people. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, fueled by the mall's own ventilation system. Thick black smoke was filling the air. "This way!" Ray yelled, pulling them towards a service corridor. They fought their way through the smoke-filled passages, the sounds of the dying mall all around them, the groaning of stressed metal, the shattering of glass, the screams of the trapped. They were almost out when he appeared, a dark silhouette in the fiery haze. Father Elijah. His face was streaked with soot, his calm demeanor gone, replaced by a prophet's righteous fury. "You have destroyed paradise!" he shrieked, lunging at them with a piece of sharpened rebar. "You have chosen the ash and the cold over salvation!" The fight was primal, brutal. Ray parried Elijah's attacks with his pry bar, but Elijah was driven by a fanatic's strength. He knocked Ray aside and went for Maya. Elena threw herself in front of her daughter. The rebar plunged deep into her side. She gasped, a look of surprise on her face before collapsing. Ray roared and attacked Elijah with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He was no longer an engineer. He was a husband, a father, a grieving animal. He brought the pry bar down again and again long after Elijah had stopped moving. He knelt by Elena's side. She was fading fast. "Go, Ray," she whispered, her hand on his cheek. "Take her. Keep her safe. Sing to her." She looked at Maya, a final fierce love in her eyes. "I love you, my little bird." Then she was gone. Ray held her for a moment, the world burning down around them, but Maya was pulling at his arm, her small face streaked with tears and soot. He picked up his wife's violin, the only piece of her he could take with him. He lifted Maya into his arms and carried her out of the burning mall, leaving the screams and the fire and the last of his own humanity behind. The world outside Brighthound was unchanged, but they were not. They walked south, two figures in a grey wasteland, a father and a daughter bound by a shared unspeakable trauma. Ray was a hollowed-out man. The quiet, analytical engineer was gone, burned away in the fire that had taken his wife. What was left was a raw, protective instinct. His entire existence was now focused on a single point, Maya. Maya was silent. The girl who had once asked endless questions now walked without a word, her eyes fixed on the gray ground. The horror she had witnessed had stolen her voice, her childhood. The journey became a walking meditation on loss. Ray's dream of the green zone was a ghost he no longer believed in. He was just putting one foot in front of the other, moving away from the fire, propelled by a momentum he didn't understand. He had become one of the survivors he had once pitied, a man with no destination, chasing a phantom. They walked for weeks. The land grew flatter, the ash thinner in some places, revealing the cracked, dead earth beneath. They saw no one. The world was utterly empty. The silence was their constant companion. Ray tried to talk to Maya, to tell her stories about the old world, about her mother, but the words felt hollow, like echoes in a tomb. He was a stranger to his own daughter, a silent guardian she no longer knew. One day they crested a low hill and saw it, a vast gray expanse stretching to the horizon. The ocean, the Gulf of Mexico. They had made it. They had reached the end of the road. There was no green zone. There was no life.